sponsored by the Institute of Museum and Library Services.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Kaplan. I'm a climate reporter at the Washington Post, and welcome to the National Book Festival. I'm here with authors Mary Roach and Suzanne Simard to talk about their books, Buzz, When Nature Breaks the Law, and Finding the Mother Tree, Discovering the Wisdom of the Forest. To learn more about our authors, check out loc.gov/bookfest. Before we begin, I want to let you know that we'll save the last 10 minutes of this 30-minute live event to respond to audience questions. You can start submitting your questions now. To get started, welcome to our two authors. And the theme of this year's book festival is Open a Book, Open the World. So the first question I just wanted to ask both of you is there a reading experience or a book that has opened a new world for you? And why don't we start with Mary?
Is there a reading experience that's opened a new, but for me, yes.
Yes.
Well, just about any book that I open, the one that jumped to mind was a book called The Fruit Hunters by Adam Leith Gallner, which is a book, it's about fruit, and you would think fruit. I don't know, how interesting could that be? But he was traveling just all over the world, taking us into this world. I mean, the fruits that we eat are a tiny percentage, and just looking at how they've evolved and the everything from the marketing and it's just an amazing. I mean, I read it quite a while ago, but it's an example of how you think about something, fruit. You think you're like fruit, okay, peaches, apples, but it's just this whole world. Literally, this world opens up, and it's just amazing. And it's not just nonfiction, but with fiction as well. There's so much research that goes into fiction, and you're stepping into this world every time. That's why I love to read.
Suzanne?
Yeah, I think one of my favorite books is Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. Robin Wall Kimmerer is a Potawatomi woman who's also a prophet, SUNY University, I believe. She teaches biology. But the most important thing about her book is that I found is just her way of expressing the worldview of Aboriginal people and how they are embedded in our natural world and the principles by which they live, which includes respect with the environment, reciprocity, responsibility, which is, I think, concepts that we think about but don't practice in the Western world. And we have a long ways to go to get out of our environmental crises. And I think that what she writes about is really what we need to do to adopt this kind of philosophy about nature. Not just a philosophy, but a way of living, a way of being, a way of respecting. So anyway, I encourage anybody who's interested in how we're going on the climate crisis, for example, and the biodiversity crisis, read that book, because I think it will really open up a whole new way of seeing things.
Yeah, both of you wrote books about the natural world, which is both our world, the one that we humans inhabit and maybe don't always pay close enough attention to or recognize our role in. And I'm wondering, sort of, when people read your books, what are you hoping they will learn from your examinations of the natural world? Mary, you wrote about humans and wildlife and conflict, and then Suzanne, yours is kind of about humans learning collaboration from the natural world. So yeah, I'm curious, what lessons from that world that is also ours are you hoping readers will take away? Suzanne, do you want to go first this time?
Sure. Well, I guess there's lots of things, but yeah, I mean, in agriculture, forestry, which has both of those things have enormous impacts on our world, in feeding our planet and housing and clothing. And, what we're doing now isn't that sustainable, if we want to think of sustainability. And we see the effects of this in global change. And I wanted to, there are just some fundamental principles that, like I was saying before, that I think we can adjust and do a much better job. And one of the things in forestry is that we forget about the collaborative part of nature, and a lot of practices we do, like spraying herbicides, our genetic breeding programs, just how we plant and grow and market trees and food plants. It's not connected to the land, and it's connected to these ideas that are not really well investigated. And I think that what we really need, and I hope that people get this from my book, is that by spending time in forests and prairies and Arctic tundra and seeing the small things and how they drive these big biogeochemical cycles, that in understanding those is absolutely, crucial to how we go on and then apply practices. So one of I think the big mistakes we've made is that we haven't understood that plants actually have multiple ways that they interact with each other. We've always sort of thought that, like forests, for example, which is my area, are structured by competition, and yet they have these incredibly collaborative interactions as well. And by ignoring that collaborative part, by getting rid of the plants that we think are competitors, for example, we actually kind of tear apart these ecosystems and send them on a very, very difficult trajectory. So anyway, that's I think is one of the main things I want people to get from my book.
Mary, did you,
Yeah.
is there sort of a lesson from the worlds that you examined?
Well, I think that, in human-wildlife conflict, people tend to, people use the word pest or nuisance animal or pest. And I think that, it puts this creature in the context of our lives and what we need and what we want. And rather than looking at this creature as, it's this independent, beautiful thing. And I think also that terminology tends to give us permission to just call someone to deal with it, whether it's an exterminator or someone to trap an animal, just make the problem go away. And in reality, almost always when you look at these conflicts, we are the cause of that. We have, often, brought one animal from one continent to another to try to, solve a problem that is often of our own making. And I just would want people just to stop and think before they call, the pest control person or someone to trap a raccoon or whatever it is, or if they're having trouble with bears, breaking into their homes if they live up in the mountains. There are ways to prevent these conflicts before they get rolling. There's things you can do. There's wonderful resources. The Humane Society of the United States has a webpage, what to do about, and species by species, ways that we can, if you, when you understand a little more about the animal and what it's doing, often it's a cyclical thing. It's only an issue part of the year. You can make your environment, you can seal it off better so they're not getting in. You can eliminate the things that are attracting them. So there's so many things that you can do to kind of coexist. So I would hope that that's the goal, to coexist. And also just, I put a wildlife camera out in my backyard. I've got squirrels and skunks and possums and roof rats. And I love just, bringing it in and seeing what they were up to in the middle of the night. So, to turn it into a positive thing and not to think of just to sort of dismiss these animals in our worlds as pests.
Yeah, I think, one question that both of your books kind of ask is, what do people owe to the natural systems that we're a part of and that support us? And what would happen if when the needs or desires of people come into conflict with the needs and desires of wild creatures or beings or trees? Like, how do you sort of weigh those two things, and what happens if we put the needs of people second? And I'm wondering, did you in the process of researching and writing your books, did you come across any examples of that happening that felt like it was it had a lesson or, was successful in a way that could be replicated, by the whole world. Because it seems like such a difficult challenge. I mean, Mary, I'm just thinking about your book and the stories about bear conflict and cases where people are, our lives are lost to wild creatures. It's very difficult to tell a person, well, this is the bear's habitat, so you have to live with that loss. So I'm curious if you found anything that felt like it could point us in the direction of answers.
Do you want me to
And I
go
guess
first?
Mary, you can go first,
Okay.
since I'm sort of
Sure.
back and forth.
Yeah. Well, I spent some time reporting in India, where there's a bit of a different philosophy. For example, with elephants, and elephants, this came as news to me because I had been brought up with Dumbo and Babar and National Geographic, and the fact that elephants kill 500 people a year in India came as quite a shock. But the approach is quite different. In India, if someone a family member is killed, there's the government compensates the family. How promptly they do that, I can't say, but that is the system, rather than destroying the animal. There are exceptions. There's sort of a 3 strikes with leopards in the Himalayas, where they've had some issues with them killing small children, sort of preying on them in that region. But the approach with the elephants is also, there's a lot of prevention that goes on. I traveled with a researcher who goes from village to village and helps people set up elephant response teams. And these are people who are trained in how to, when an elephant comes into a village, a group, because they're social animals and they travel in big groups, big animals, big groups, they can do a lot of damage to the crops in these villages. And when people just run out screaming, lighting firecrackers, the torches and things, the animals get freaked out. They disperse when they leave the group. They're less stable and it's more dangerous. So these people are trained to handle the situation in a safe way, kind of steer the elephants away so that nobody gets hurt. And they're working on a number of different sort of early warning systems. One of them is to use a seismic measurements a seismic meters to detect when they're approaching. It's either an earthquake or an elephant if the meter goes off. So there are ways, there's different ways to deal with it. And also because the elephant, Ganesh is revered is an elephant god. So there's a kind of built-in reverence and affinity for these creatures and a desire for them not to be harmed. That's true with monkeys as well there. So that kind of informs the whole approach in a kind of lovely way. So that trip was was kind of inspirational in that way.
That's fascinating. I had no idea that they are going to use seismic tools to detect elephants. That's genius. That's amazing. I can talk a little bit about here on the west coast of Canada, and I think it's probably true in the US as well, but I think everybody knows in the world that our west coast salmon populations are at incredible risk right now. They've been basically the populations have gone to levels that that we worry, or that that they're on the edge of extinction. And this is a result of, I guess, exploitation since the colonization of North America. And I just wanted to speak to ancient fishing practices that actually enhanced salmon populations instead of driving them to the brink of collapse. And there are ways to do this. And there's, I think that, we can recover these populations, I believe, if we practice these more holistic and careful methods that have respect and obligations to look after these incredible resources. So here's one example. Along the West Coast, there were many ancient fishing technologies that were considered passive technologies. And for example, fishing weirs, and I was just actually up in the Quequet territory, which is in the northern part of Vancouver Island. area, where we were looking at fish weirs that are, or in this area where fish weirs that were over 800 years old based on carbon dating. There are ancient tidal stone traps that date back thousands of years, 10,000 years. And I'll just speak to that for a little bit. So these ancient tidal stone traps have been built along the west coast of British Columbia, along salmon spawning rivers and streams by the different nations, the Quechua, as well as the Kwakwaka'wakw, the Heiltsuk, the Tsimshian, the Tlingit, all those nations along the coast. And how it worked was that they would, when the tide, so they built these walls. Basically, they're walls. They're walls that follow the contour of the ocean. And as the tide comes in and then the tide goes back out again, on the lowest ebb tide, the salmon during spawning season are trapped behind these stone walls, and the nations would harvest the salmon as they needed them. And they always allowed, though, the big mother fish to go upstream to spawn. And so they only kept the smallest fish. And big mother fish have big eggs and they spawn big offspring. And so this actually, we think, might have enhanced their populations. It was kind of a way of managing the populations. Bears also play an incredibly important role in this, in that they also fish for these salmon in spawning season, and they take them up into the forest and eat them under big old mother trees. And these old mother trees actually soak up the remains of the salmon and store that nitrogen, that salmon nitrogen, in the rings of these old trees. The trees grow faster, they shade the streams, they moderate the temperatures and provide food that actually helps the fry that emerge in the spring. And so, and also the nations would, of course, when they fish for the salmon, they would always return the bones, basically the inedible parts, back to the rivers to enhance the nutrient status of the rivers. And so, as you can see, like, this is a cycle that is a loop, a positive feedback loop, that, you know, what the people do enhance what the salmon do, which enhances the bears, which enhances the forest, and this circle goes around and round in a positive feedback. When colonization happened, those ancient tidal stone traps were actually deactivated. They were outlawed in many cases, and the fisheries was taken over by the Canadian government. And the consequences of this, of not actually knowing what we're doing, of over-harvesting, especially of the larger fish, is borne out now in our salmon population. So there's so much we can learn from these old technologies that will actually help our modern populations to recover lost biodiversity.
So we're talking right now amid this huge crisis for both humanity and what we consider the natural world, right? Climate change. Humans burning fossil fuels and other activities have changed our planet faster than at any other point in its history. And I wonder, you know, your books come out in this moment where the effects of climate change are so obvious, right? We just had this summer that was disastrous on every continent, with drought and fire in the West, and flooding from Louisiana to New York and all around the world. And I just, you know, I wonder if there's something from these books that you hope people will bring to this moment and to their understanding of climate change. What would you want people to take away? And so, Suzanne, why don't you go first, since we're switching back?
Well, just simply a couple of things. Well, just, you know, to remember two things, I think. One is our old growth forests, of which we're losing rapidly due to harvesting, not just in North America, but South America, in the Amazon, the boreal forests of Eurasia, and Canada, where we're clear cutting our last few percent of old growth forest. That these old forests are irreplaceable, especially in the context of climate change. They're not ever going to be the same, and yet they are biodiversity and carbon storage hotspots. And we think we can replace them with plantations, but they don't store as much carbon, not even close. And the biodiversity is also hammered by this. And so number one is we need to stop doing that. We're killing ourselves by harvesting these old growth forests. And then secondly, from a forest perspective, to restore what we have degraded. You know, these are two very important things that we simply have to face and do something about it if we're going to, you know, bootstrap ourselves back out of global change.
There were a couple of things that I came across in my reporting. I mean, I wasn't setting out to write about climate change per se, but it kept coming up when I was spending time with a bear researcher in Colorado, and he talked about a study that had looked at when temperatures rise, hibernation periods for black bears become shorter. So with every, I think it was about 2 degrees Fahrenheit increase in temperature, that's a week shorter hibernation period. And there was a projection to like 2050, if things continue, that would mean a shorter hibernation period by between 15 and 40 days. And so that's 15 to 40 days more that bears will be out on the land looking for food, and people complaining about bears, and more conflicts. So that was going on. Also, I was in New Zealand reporting on something entirely different, but I was at this in the Otago Peninsula, which is a beautiful place. There's these yellow-eyed penguins, just a really exotic looking, beautiful bird. And there's only a few thousand of them left. And one thing that's going on, I mean, I was there because talking about the interplay between invasive species and some of the flightless birds, well, some of the flighted birds as well. But what one of the other things that was going on with these birds was that they fish. They go out every day to fish, to get food, to feed their young, and they're having to go further and further out because as the waters have warmed, they need to, the fish that they feed on have moved into deeper waters, so they're having trouble. They can't dive that deep, so they're having difficulty getting food. So just everywhere you turn, there's some effect of climate change that it's everywhere. I just felt like every time I asked about something, part of the answer was climate change.
I want to make sure that I make time for some questions from the folks who are watching. When Robert McCoy asked a couple of questions actually, but both are sort of on the same topic, which is that, both of you should express so much joy in the natural world. And he was wondering, do you find that it's best to be outside in it? Is that the best way to appreciate it? And then how do you help people who maybe don't have easy access, or who are sort of, there are barriers between them and being out in nature? How do you sort of help them appreciate and experience that joy? Mary, why don't you go?
Wow. I'm not. I mean, yes. The more you can be out in the natural world. I mean, just speaking personally, it's such a balm and a therapy. BALM, that is, just to be in nature and to explore nature in different locations and different ecosystems it's for me. There's nothing like it. I don't know, for somebody who's doesn't have easy access, I'm not sure. I don't have a handy answer. Maybe Suzanne does.
Yeah, I think, I get to spend a lot of time out in forests because I'm a researcher, forest researcher. And so that's where my world, it has been my whole life. But I think there are many things that people can do, even if you live in a big city. Just connecting with a tree or a plant in your local park makes a difference. Just to go and sit with that tree and feel its presence and honor its presence. And if you don't have access to trees, any kind of plant or creature, even watching ants crawling around in the soil, it connects you. And the more time you can do that, the more you fall in love with it and you'll seek those experiences out. So I think probably most everybody has got access to even an ant. So that's what I would say. Just start there and just spend the time and enjoy it.
Another question from an audience member named Jeanette is, she asks, ever since I found out that trees talk to each other, I have been wondering, do we have any science on communication between species within ecosystems? And I thought that actually, even though that's sort of focused on Suzanne's work, Mary, you write a bit about the ideas of animal intelligence and what we know about how animals think. So I thought both of you might have an interesting answer to that question.
I'm afraid I don't know much about animal communication, so I'm going to turn this one over to Suzanne. Yeah.
Yeah, I think if you walk into an ecosystem, like all these creatures are, working with each other, and it's like, imagine yourself in your family, and how you have these relationships with all these family members. They're all different. They're all nuanced and sophisticated and complex, and it's the same thing in forests or any ecosystem where you've got lots of creatures, pollinators, animals, trees, plants. They're in a constant communication, and they have to be, because they're completely interdependent, intertwined. So in the tree world, now we know that they actually link below ground through fungal networks, and they communicate by sharing not just water and carbon and nitrogen, but information about their species identity, about how healthy they are, how rich or poor they are. And they share this information to enhance the vitality of the whole community. It doesn't mean they don't have other ways, that's collaboration. They compete with each other as well in certain ways, shading each other, or taking up resources that might exclude another species. But ultimately, it's the ecosystem, the health of the ecosystem, that protects all of them. And so they do this by being in constant contact, constant communication.
So we've only got 3 minutes left, which is probably time for one more question. And I think this is one that both of you can answer. Both of your books contain some really hard stories. Suzanne, you write about forests that have been clear cut and doused with pesticides, and Mary, you write about, there's some like heartbreaking descriptions of eradication campaigns to deal with non-native species in various places, and animals on the brink of extinction. How do you both avoid despair when writing about these really hard, and just when experiencing and witnessing these really hard things? Maybe take 1 minute each, starting with Mary.
That's a good question, and I didn't always do it successfully, but I think I try to focus a little bit on some of the more positive developments. There are so many people now trying to work on coexistence, and meaning bringing together the people who've been at loggerheads, like the farmers, the ranchers and the hunters, and then the environmentalists, but bringing them into a room to speak, and also more than to speak, to listen, and to try to hear what each other are saying and understand, and come up with some kind of way forward, and for legislation to come out of these discussions, rather than just someone in the back room making a decision. So the fact that this is going on, and there's been some, the people that run these organizations seem to be optimistic, and if they can be a little optimistic, then I try to hold on to that too.
Yeah, I completely agree with Mary that getting people in the same room to discuss, even if they're at odds, is the way to go. And this, we come up with better answers. And I think what makes me hopeful is that I've been studying, systems, ecosystems for a long time, and systems are resilient systems, like our natural systems, which means that they have the ability to heal and to recover from travesty, given all the, given these strong relationships that the very example Mary is talking about, not just between the ecological creatures in the ecosystems, but humans as ecological creatures as well, that are working with these systems to help them recover. We have the incredible power to make positive changes, and we just need to get together, put our minds, get the right legislation, get the right policies in place, and you can start to see the incremental improvements.
I think that's probably the perfect note to end on. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have, but thank you so much, Mary and Suzanne, for sharing your time and your insights, and thanks to everyone in the audience for your questions. You can keep enjoying the National Book Festival at loc.gov/bookfest, and I hope that you keep learning.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Thank you.